Friends and supporters of Australian music, welcome to the presentation of the 2019 Paul Lowin Prizes and Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Genevieve Lacey. I'm the chair of the Australian Music Centre Board, and it's so lovely that you're here this evening to join us. Thank you for coming. Here in this beautiful room, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and we pay our respects to the thousands of generations of culture and lawmakers who've gathered in this place before us. We're privileged to be here, and we're inspired by the ongoing traditions of cultural leadership by our Indigenous people, embodied this evening by Deborah Cheetham. Tonight's prizes are presented by Perpetual as trustee for the Paul Lowin Prizes. The Australian Music Centre is honoured to collaborate with Perpetual in administering the prizes. Paul Lowin wrote his will in the late 1950s, bequeathing these generous prizes to exceptional composers. A really visionary act at a time when few Australians showed much pride or interest in the music produced in this country. This year, the Paul Lowin Prizes received the largest number of entries ever, and we congratulate all entrants on their contributions, a wonderful testament to the vibrancy of Australian composition today. Musicologist Graham Skinner described the inaugural Lowin Awards as music's equivalent to the Archibald Prize, so we're very pleased you're all here tonight for this auspicious occasion. It's an act of great courage to make a life as a composer. The only certainty for this profession in contemporary Australia is challenge. And the only people who accept this vocation are singular. Contemporary philosopher Jonathan Lear writes of radical hope, which he describes as an ability to envision possibilities beyond those handed down by our existing culture. I'll say that again, as it's a beautiful idea. An ability to envision possibilities beyond those handed down by our existing culture. Composers have an essential role to play in imagining and voicing and living radical hope. Theirs is a life spent dreaming and articulating the once unimaginable, and in doing so, creating pathways for the rest of us into a possible future. We need them more than ever at this point in history. So tonight we salute composers. We thank you for your essential work, and we celebrate some particularly stunning Australian pieces. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Clementine Lucas, Philanthropy Services Manager from Perpetual.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Genevieve. It is my pleasure to be here and speak on behalf of Perpetual. We're here not only to celebrate the recipients of the Paul Lowin Prizes, of which Perpetual is trustee, but to support for the first time, in association with the Australian Music Centre, the Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as the custodians of this land. I pay my respect to Australia's First Peoples and to their elders, past and present, and would like to extend my respect to all Aboriginal people who are here this evening. I'm thrilled to be back here in this magnificent venue, the Melbourne Recital Centre. I actually had the privilege of working here in the development team before joining Perpetual, so it's great to see some familiar faces. As well as the wonderful people and inspiring work, I always considered myself so fortunate to work in such an incredible building, the best place to hear music. To be back in the stunning Primrose Potter Salon is particularly special. But tonight we will be announcing the winners of the Paul Lowin Prizes, including the Orchestral Prize of $25,000 and the Song Cycle Prize of $15,000. We will also be acknowledging 4 highly commended recipients. The Paul Lowin Prizes represent one of Australia's most generous musical gifts, and a continuing testament to the power of philanthropy. The prizes were established through the generosity and foresight of Paul Lowin through his will, which was found following his death in Vienna in 1961. The Paul Lowin Trust supports Australian music composition by creating a competition for works by living Australian composers and the development of music in Australia. Paul Lowin's legacy not only provides composers opportunities to continue their work, but also recognises the important benefits that composers and their music provide to the community. A successful businessman, Lowin immigrated to Australia from Czechoslovakia in 1939, just as World War II was developing. Aside from business, his great passion in life was music, and he brought this passion to Australia with him. The Paul Lowin Prizes are a great example of the impact that one person can have through philanthropic giving, and Perpetual is proud to be the trustee of the prizes to continue Lowin's legacy. Since their establishment in 1991, the Paul Lowin Prizes have awarded close to $450,000 to deserving Australian composers. Perpetual wishes to thank the Australian Music Centre for their vital role in ensuring that Paul Lowin's vision and intent are fulfilled, a role that Perpetual as trustee takes very seriously. Our thanks also to the judges who undertake the extremely difficult task of assessing the many applications. We would also like to acknowledge the late Ken Tribe, patron of the Paul Lowin Prizes. Ken's involvement dates back to 1974, when we approached him to investigate the unfinished work that had been undertaken regarding Lowin's will. Ken was a lawyer and was well known for his interest and activities in the field of music. His tireless efforts and enthusiasm have ensured that the prizes remain as relevant today. So we congratulate not only the winners tonight, but all the talented composers that contribute to our cultural life in Australia. I'd now like to hand back to Genevieve to announce the 2019 recipients.
Thanks, Clementine. And now to the presentation of the prizes. Firstly, to the 2019 Paul Lowin Song Cycle Prize. So the three finalists are Katy Abbott, Hidden Thoughts No. 1 from 2017 for 6 voices, 2 sopranos, alto, tenor, baritone and bass, and mixed instrumental sextet. Text by anonymous contributors. Hidden Thoughts 1 is the first composition in a series of festival pieces, a 60-minute work for the Song Company and Syzygy Ensemble based on the hidden thoughts of women collected in an anonymous survey. It's available for listening online as an ABC New Waves podcast. And the jury commented, "This uniquely Australian work has an innovative and beautifully nuanced score, with the compelling texts always shining through. The composer shows an excellent technical understanding for each voice type, with voiceless interludes focusing the narrative and establishing a wonderful emotional connection for the listener, an inclusive and interactive work for the audience." And the second nomination, Elliot Geiger, This Kind of Life, a culinary correspondence from 2018 for soprano, mezzo-soprano, clarinet, cello, harp and piano. A setting of correspondence between celebrated chef Julia Child and her friend Avis Devoto. The jury comments, a whimsical and clever work based on a delightfully touching subject matter. The playful aspects and the witty use of the text draws the listener in so they're invested in following the correspondence right to the end. A skillful piece, both musically and emotionally. And the next nomination is for Luke Stiles on Bunya from 2018 for tenor, piano and string quartet, settings of 10 poems by Les Murray. And for this one, the jury comments, an extremely well-written work with skillful evocations of life in rural Australia, from the raw and beautiful to the sophisticated and understated. The instrumental writing supports the vocal writing well throughout. Clementine, would you like to join me as we make the announcement? So, very excited to say that the winner of the 2019 Paul Lowin Song Cycle Prize is Hidden Thoughts by Katy Abbott.
Thank you. Mum was thrilled to be nominated for this award and is pretty disappointed that she can't be here tonight. She's asked Layla and I to say a couple of words on her behalf.
Okay. Katy has asked me to read this for her. When I sent out an anonymous survey asking women over the age of 18 for their hidden thoughts, I wasn't sure what would happen. The breadth, honesty and elegance of the responses was so much more than I had hoped for. Although this work was a great challenge, my longest and most complex project to date, at times the words were easy to set. Now, when I say easy, I mean musically satiating. Emotionally, it was really tough. I asked women what they had learned to be brave about and what they would like to be braver about. I was aware that it could be a confronting thing to delve into those thoughts. What I wasn't expecting was the weight of the responsibility of holding, resonating and sitting deeply with those words, real people's unspoken thoughts. We can never really know the weight of what other people are carrying with them, all humans, not just women. My hope is that sharing and hearing the narrative of other people's inner lives, this work will foster a kindness and patience from one human to another.
Mum says that she's honoured for Hidden Thoughts to be here alongside all the other works in this year's award, and she offers her congratulations to all the finalists. For helping to get Hidden Thoughts to its recorded form, sincere thanks to the Australia Council for the Arts for the grant to compose the work, Syzygy Ensemble and the Song Company. Mum said writing for them was like composing for a musical dream team. The Melbourne Conservatorium of Music, ABC Classic, Eucharia Cultural Centre and the Australian Music Centre. To all the people who contributed to the Australian Cultural Fund, Kaz Cook, Layla Ingle, Anthony Pitts, Thomas D. Mallet Burgess for their interpretive contribution. Thanks to the Paul Lowin Trust and Perpetual Trustee Company Limited for their generosity and foresight to support Australian music in this way. Paul Lowin arrived in Melbourne from Czechoslovakia in 1939, and my grandfather, who is here today, his parents arrived from Bratislava a few years later. It's really lovely to acknowledge the synergy coming together here tonight. Finally, Mum wishes to say thanks to her parents who helped create the time to write music, and to the women who submitted their anonymous responses to the survey. She doesn't know who you are, but your responses were full of heart, hilarity, depth, grief, and generosity. Thank you.
We're sorry Katie's not here, but they were such beautiful speeches. Thank you. I know I shouldn't say this, but your mother would be extremely proud of you. And so now to the 2019 Paul Lowin Orchestral Prize. So the three finalists are Brett Dean, Cello Concerto from 2018 for cello and orchestra. Dean's Cello Concerto was written for Alban Gerhardt and co-commissioned by Musikgebouw, Amsterdam Cello Biennale, Sydney Symphony Orchestra, Minnesota Symphony Orchestra, and the Swedish Radio Symphony Orchestra. The judges note, an amazing work with expressive, beautifully wrought orchestration. The use of rich harmony and the well-built tension curve ensures the work never outstays its welcome, keeping the listener's interest to the very end. And the second nomination is Lachlan Skipworth's Spiritus from 2017 for Symphony Orchestra. Spiritus was written for and premiered by the Western Australian Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Daniel Blendorf. The work won the Albert Maggs Composition Award in 2017. The judges say that Spiritus stood out from the category as being completely different from the other works, with a unique identity. It's beautifully orchestrated with an appealing gestural nature. And the third piece is Nigel Westlake's Spirit of the Wild, Concerto for Oboe from 2016. Spirit of the Wild was commissioned with funds provided by the late extraordinarily generous Jane Matthews AO and Symphony Services International. It was premiered by oboist Diana Doherty and the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, conducted by David Robertson. The judges were impressed with the engaging and idiomatic writing for the oboe, with a rich orchestral texture always in balance with the oboe. A captivating work, they said, transcending technicality and going straight to the heart, a temporal experience. So, Clementine, will you come back for the announcement? So we're delighted to say that the winner of the 2019... I'm so sorry, of course we need to hear it. I'm so sorry, please. Thank you. Apologies. So, the winner of the 2019 Paul Lowin Orchestral Prize is, in fact, Spirit of the Wild.
Thanks so much. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand tonight, the traditional people from the Kulin Nation, and I honour elders past, present and emerging. It's very humbling for me to be sharing the list of on the finalists with Brett and Lachlan, two composers whose work I hold in the absolute highest esteem. And I'm very deeply humbled to be accepting the prize tonight. I'd like to thank Clementine and everyone from Perpetual, and Jen and John Davis and everyone from the AMC. AMC for their unerring and resolute, devoted support of Australian music in all its myriads of expressions and forms. And whilst I'm on the subject of devoted support, I'd like to thank my wife, Janice, for her incredible tolerance and love and understanding of what through every project that comes up. The piece was inspired by a trip to the wilderness of Tasmania with the environmentalist Bob Brown, and I owe a sincere debt to Bob for his mentorship and guidance in showing me some of these magical areas of the earth, and these concepts that formed the catalyst for this work. I was commissioned by the Sydney Symphony, and I'm very appreciative of their ongoing support, and particularly through David Robertson and a number of performances and taking the work on tour, and of course providing the resources for the ABC Classics recording. I can't say enough about Diana Doherty's support, incredible oboe prodigy that she is, her commitment to the work and her supreme artistry and friendship has had a profound impact and helped to shape the work in many mysterious and indelible ways. The funding, of course, provided by Jane Matthews and Symphony Services, and Jane passed in August this year, and through the process of writing this work, I became much closer to Jane than I was even anticipating, and I discovered an amazing woman, a compassionate humanitarian, a staunch advocate for gender equality and social reform, and an individual whose contributions to Australian music and culture are incalculable. And I'd like to take this opportunity to dedicate this award to the memory of Jane with love, respect and sincere gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel, and congratulations to all those brilliant composers. To conclude this part of the evening, our thanks go to everyone who's contributed to the success of these prizes. In particular, we'd like to thank the 2019 Paul Lowin jury members, Alison Bell, Michael Black, Jessica Cottis, Stephen Grant, Benjamin Northey, Peter Swinnan, so ably chaired by Liz Terracini. These distinguished colleagues worked extremely hard in assessing the many entries, and their collective knowledge, experience and wisdom is greatly appreciated. Deepest thanks also to Perpetual for their careful management of the Paul Lowin Trust. And now to the 21st Annual Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address. It's particularly fitting that this evening's address is taking place in the beautiful Melbourne Recital Centre, whose Director of Programming, Marshall Maguire, established the address to challenge the status quo and raise issues of importance in new music in Australia today. In his role then as the president of the New Music Network, the inaugural address coincided with the reopening of the studio at Sydney Opera House in 1999, a momentous occasion and one full of hope and promise for new music. The first address was delivered by James Murdoch, Glanville-Hicks's longtime friend and the person who encouraged her to return to Australia in 1975 when she took up a role created for her at the then newly established Australian Music Centre. Over the 20 years since, this address has become a context in which leading figures in our music community present the only public address in music in the country. So Marshall, on reaching this 21st milestone, we acknowledge and thank you for your vision in founding this very important forum. And on behalf of the Australian Music Centre, we express our gratitude to the New Music Network for its beautiful custodianship of the address, which from this year, the AMC now assumes with the greatest respect. And now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce the 2019 Peggy Glanville-Hicks orator, Deborah Cheetham. I'm sure that most people by now would be well acquainted with Deborah's biograph and her list of extraordinary achievements. However, for the purposes of this evening's address, Deborah requested that I simply introduce her as a 21st century urban woman who's Yorta Yorta by birth, stolen generation by policy, soprano by diligence, composer by necessity, and lesbian by practice. So please, let's welcome Deborah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Genevieve. Thank you. We had a deal, Genevieve and I, that she would give that introduction. Artists pretty much write their own bios, and we sit there cringing as people work their way through paragraph after paragraph, and usually they're out of date by a couple of years. And I've just decided that I think it's better if I'm just really honest and how I see myself. So thank you, Genevieve. We've set the bar high, and that's my bio from now on. Now, I'm not going to take any selfies. Oh, actually, I probably will. I've got this up here to, I don't know what 35 minutes is, as anyone who knows me will tell you. So I've put a little alarm there, and we'll see how we go. I see bottles of champagne. They're not getting any colder, so... It is a great honour, though, to be here with you this evening in this beautiful venue. I've loved this venue since the first pylon went into the ground. And it's a great honour to be accepting a role on the board of the MRC, and that was just announced last week. This is the 21st annual Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address. And when I stand on this country, I know that I have the ancestors of the Bunwurrung and their very close neighbours, the Wurundjeri, to thank for the strength that I feel, the strength that I can draw upon. And for 70,000 years or more, the Kulin nations have sung and danced and painted their culture on this land. This land has a long memory. You know, when the old police hospital, which is now one of the admin buildings for the University of Melbourne, when that was first built, the language of the Bunwurrung could still be heard here on this land. It's worth remembering that connection. In all the world, the entire world, Australia alone can lay claim to the longest continuing cultures. We live each day drawing energy from a land which has been nurtured by its traditional owners for more than 2,000 generations. And although we celebrate this fact more today than at any other time since our shared history began, there is little doubt in my mind that there is still a great deal of progress to be made. In preparing for this evening, I started to think about the many public addresses I have given during my career. A decade ago, I spoke about the lack of opportunity for Indigenous opera singers, the need for new lyrics for our national anthem, and of the luxury of failure, an experience at that time not often afforded to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. If you failed, either personally or publicly, you failed on behalf of every Aboriginal person. Sadly, this equation did not operate in the reverse. A success made you out of the ordinary. And perhaps that was so on occasion. But most of the time, I found myself to be exercising a kind of life practice that was not merely the result of education or nurturing, but part of my DNA. And it extends me to this very day, well beyond the hybrid of humanity you see before you. But as I thought about those many public addresses, it wasn't surprising that a common theme has remained throughout the 30 years of my career in the arts sector. And that is the power and the necessity of music, and the role it plays in shaping and sustaining communities. Music is my earliest memory. For me, it's my way of knowing the world and making sense of everything in it. You know, I say that it's a common theme, the power and necessity of music. I was talking with members of the AMC, in particular John. I want to acknowledge you and the work that you are doing, and Genevieve as the chair of our board, a board that I'm proud to serve on. And I was talking about the kind of addresses that I've given, and I said, look, I used to always write my speeches. I was taught well in high school that you wrote those speeches down, you collated them and you kept them. And I have for a very long time. But there came a point in my life where I had to stop writing the speeches down. Because on the way to an event, something would happen that I simply could not ignore, that I simply needed to respond to. And it happened this evening. I've been away over the weekend, performing in Brisbane, but on the way here I was listening to one of the afternoon news programs, and I heard an horrendous story of how music can be used for the basest of activities, and that was a group of high school boys foolish enough to wear their blazers proudly, degrading women in song. It served as a reminder to me that it can go either way, this power of music. And we have to, as a community, find the way to harness it so that it shapes our society, the kind of Australia that we want to live in, the kind of Australia we would like our children to live in, the kind of Australia that those children really don't understand at all, but they need to. If you haven't heard of that news story, go online. It is pretty disturbing. But we have to be grown up and we have to hear the disturbing stories, and we need to deal with them. And we need to hold our communities and our parents and our principals and our staff. And wherever that ugliness comes from, we need to hold it to account, the leadership that allows for that kind of behaviour. We're on a public tram. Boys take licence to degrade women in song. Because I think, whenever I have the opportunity to address an audience such as this, or whether it's my children's choir, Dungalla Children's Choir, if I'm speaking to them, I think, what is the purpose of this? For what do we strive in our lives? Why do we build? Why do we search and research? Why do we demand that medical science finds a way to prolong our lives, if not to gain the deepest possible knowledge and understanding of ourselves? Everything drives to that single purpose for me. And you see, the longest practice of knowing oneself is through the arts. Music, dance, art, the spoken narrative. This is how humankind has traditionally made sense of its existence. It is our way of knowing. For Indigenous Australians, this is how all knowledge was acquired and passed on. Longer here than anywhere else in the world. What a celebration that should be as a nation. To quote one of Dungalla Children's Choir's songs, a song is not merely a song. It can be a map to our identity. It can help us find the way home. A song is not merely a song. What are the implications for our society when access to arts education and participation in the arts are diminished? What is the agenda of governments that seek to limit arts funding or direct it in such a way that certain critical voices are silenced? As an arts community, we must ask ourselves, what is to be our response? After more than 30 years as an educator and a performing artist, I started life actually as a high school music teacher. I reckon if you've done that for long enough, you can pretty much count on being able to do anything, because you have to. But in all of that time, and as a performing artist, and a decade at the helm of short black opera, we celebrate 10 years today. And my team is in the house. All 2.5 of us. My partner in life and music, Tony Lalich, please, ladies and gentlemen. One of the most understanding company managers and the finest vocal coaches you'd ever hope to meet. And honestly, a musician with such talent, ability, and absolute drive to make sure that perfection is achieved. The other half is our project manager. Please welcome Jessica Hitchcock. Tam, I don't forget you. My daughter is actually sitting between them. So, you know, this is a team that really is a family. Jess is our adopted daughter, Tamara my daughter, and together this last decade, Short Black Opera has seen a situation that really, I can tell you, it's actually getting harder, not easier, to maintain the unbroken thread of cultural expression that makes Australia unique in the world. It's actually getting harder, not easier. Indigenous artists and organisations are in a constant battle against the threat of exploitation and misinterpretation of themselves and of their cultural content. Since the process of colonisation began in Australia, the arts have suffered a prolonged dislocation from their traditional role at the centre of society. I would see us returned to that role. But this dislocation results in yet another way in which Indigenous Australians suffer disadvantage, as our way of knowing is devalued, our access to it reduced, and control over our cultural knowledge is usurped. It is worth remembering that at the same time the Brandis cuts shamefully weakened our industry, pitting artists against one another and forcing us to compete for ever-dwindling resources. Funding previously set aside for Indigenous-led organisations was made available to anyone and everyone. Unfortunately, this has led to many examples of cultural theft and profiteering. I'm glad to say that there are many fine partnerships which have also developed in that time. But it is alarming, the amount of cultural theft I am still seeing at the moment in our community. In speaking out about it, I'm hopefully providing a learning opportunity for the people who need to hear it. I know we're being streamed tonight. I know this will be published, which is why I wrote it down. It's a learning opportunity. I'm not in the habit of closing doors. It's not in my nature. I don't think it gets us where we want to go. Indigenous artists have to compete with non-Indigenous organisations for the support needed to tell their own stories. Over the past few years, I've seen an alarming increase in the number of very loose invitations from non-Indigenous organisations who, upon receiving funding for an Indigenous project, then set out to locate the necessary Indigenous performers to make it viable. These invitations sometimes arrive in my inbox very late in the process of the project and are really nothing more than a thinly veiled afterthought of compliance. I've got a real problem with that word compliance, as some of you may know. Well, so many people are treating it like a destination. At best, it's a departure point, and not always. And we cannot treat compliance as the destination, the end point. This practice of the afterthought of inviting the Indigenous person to their own culture is not and has never been an acceptable practice, but it is going on today, and I need you to call it out when you see it. This situation is, without doubt, the result of our nation's failure to deal with both historical and contemporary dispossession and the exploitation of Indigenous knowledge and cultural practice. We have arrived at this state and are pinned there by a society which is increasingly deprived of the broadest possible artistic engagement. It is deliberate. At the same time, our nation's leaders do very little to promote the level of emotional intelligence and maturity which Australia so desperately needs. Sadly, we find ourselves heading into the third decade of the 21st century as a materially wealthy nation undermined by attitudes of arrogance and entitlement, resulting in an increasingly impoverished spirit. If you needed evidence of that, you only needed to be somewhere near that tram packed full of St Kevin's Year 10 boys on their way to something. We have seen an increase of commercial considerations, forcing and in some cases enabling flagship companies to produce an ever-diminishing range of works, very few of which could be considered groundbreaking. There are exceptions, of course. I've been privileged to be part of them and I've seen others. But the vital task of ensuring diversity and growth is often left to the small to medium sector. As the artistic director of one such small organisation, I can tell you that the battle to exist is constant. And the only thing that keeps short black opera going is the knowledge that we have absolutely no other choice. Without short black opera, there is no Indigenous opera in Australia. For me personally, this role is not simply what I do, a stepping stone to somewhere else. It is who I am. For myself and the members of my company, we have a duty of care to the broader Australian community, but as well, for the Aboriginal members of our team, we have a specific cultural responsibility that has been passed down to us by our ancestors. It is absolutely critical for emerging Indigenous artists to have the opportunity to see Indigenous leadership at the highest possible level in all arts organisations, especially those which seek to produce and present Indigenous content. To the philanthropic community and to arts funding bodies who are committed to supporting the vitality and authenticity of Indigenous cultures, I recommend that you ask each of the following 4 questions before supporting non-Indigenous artists and organisations who seek to profit from Indigenous cultural knowledge, particularly where children and young adults are concerned. The 4 questions are, firstly, how many Indigenous people does the organisation employ at an executive level? I'm not talking about the person who gets the coffees. Actually, I'm the person who gets the coffees at Short Black Opera, so forget that example. Secondly, how many Indigenous people are on the creative team? And what is their level of authority in the decision-making process? Make sure you see evidence of these people. They can be spoken about and not actually yet engaged for the task. Thirdly, how many Indigenous people are on the board of the organisation you intend to support? Finally, what is the ratio of Indigenous to non-Indigenous support staff, particularly where children are involved? These are some of the questions that short black opera has begun to ask in earnest over the last few years. Now, whilst there are very few organisations who can currently pass muster, we just have to work towards raising the standard. Tonight, I offer this challenge to our industry and our arts community to accept, promote, and take these standards of Indigenous engagement even further. It will not be a simple task. Is anything that we do simple? It will not be simple, but it is necessary for the process of collaboration to become respectful, more nuanced, and thereby sustainable. As you heard in my now very brief biographical note, as a 21st century urban woman who is Yorta Yorta by birth, stolen generation by government policy, soprano by a whole lot of hard work and diligence, and composer by necessity. Throughout my career, I have constantly been called upon to explain myself and justify my place in the world of classical music. It has been a hard road, and acceptance is not guaranteed. I thought long and hard about sharing this example with you. But as evidence of my experience, very recently I gave a performance, and upon returning to my dressing room after that performance, I found a message on my dressing room table of racial and gender-specific hatred left for me to find. As artists, we rely on the area backstage to be a safe place in which we can prepare ourselves for the ultimate act of gift giving, which is performance. To have had that space violated was a breathtaking reminder that we have such a long way to go as a nation and as an arts community before our female artists, and in particular those of colour, can feel safe, included, and empowered. Someone had the courage to do that to me. I have a children's choir. How do I keep them safe from that? I have young artists that I mentor. How do I keep them safe? Earlier this year, when the volume was finally turned up on the conversation of violence towards women in the world of opera and in opera plots themselves, I found myself taking stock of my long love affair with the art form, which of course began when I first encountered the incomparable Dame Joan Sutherland on the 19th of February 1979 at a performance in the Sydney Opera House. For 2 decades, my love of opera was fuelled by the kind of access you can only dream of today. I could have $15 and see 4 operas and still have change left for a cornetto. There were seasons of varied repertoire with high quality production and local talent. That was typical of our flagship company under the leadership of Bonning and Oxenbould in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Many questions have been raised about the content of the stories in the repertoire we see year after year in opera. I believe that the very best examples of this complex and beautiful art form serve to reveal and amplify our humanity. The death of a female character on stage must be an absolute tragedy, not merely an inevitable and strangely fulfilling experience. There can be no compromise. In my opera, Pecan Summer, the trauma suffered by the female characters comes directly from the lived experience of my own Aboriginal mother, grandmother, and myself. Yes, there is violence, but this is reality. The violence is not celebrated. It is exposed. In that case, it is part of our nation's history. But there is a danger in opera when we export violence to an exotic location or a distant time. We run the risk of distancing ourselves from the truth of violence in our own time and in our own lives. It is therefore the responsibility of producers and directors to find a way to remain faithful to the composer and the librettist's wishes while exposing the humanity of the situation. As most of you know, I did not begin my public life as a composer. For most of my career, I've been best known for my work as a soprano, although as a student of music, I began my formal training as an instrumentalist, majoring in piano and flute. My role as a composer developed relatively late in life, and basically through necessity. I had experienced, during the first 20 years of my career after graduating from the Sydney Con, a classical music industry where Indigenous voices were kept out, were kept silent, or were simply reinterpreted by non-Indigenous composers. As the years passed on and I continued to be overlooked by major companies as a performer, I realised that things would not change for the next generation of Indigenous singers unless I created a space in which they could safely develop their skills and express themselves on stage. And so a decade ago, this led to the creation of Short Black Opera. I've spent the last 20 years developing my compositional voice. And during that time, I've had the honour to specialise in coupling the beauty and diversity of our Indigenous languages with the power and beauty and intensity of classical music. This began with Dalimana Gamarada, written for the opening ceremony of the 2000 Olympic Games, followed by Pecan Summer, which I'm happy to announce to you as an audience this evening, will celebrate its 10th anniversary here with 2 performances in the Dame Elizabeth Murdoch Hall in October 2020. After Pecan Summer, many other smaller works, but then Yumaralla, a war requiem for peace, entirely in the languages of the Gunditjmara people, thanks to the skill and the dedication of language custodian Vicky Cousins and linguist Travis Ira. We had a wonderful success of Yumaralla down on country last year and another one here with the MSO in Hamer Hall. We've just come back from Brisbane where it premiered there a few days ago, and next year we're off to Perth in July. There are opportunities and there are good people to work with, but we need to grow more good people, and we need to arrest the development of the exploitation of Indigenous arts and the exclusion of Indigenous artists from their own stories by helping people to understand that you have nothing to lose in collaboration, and maybe that collaboration starts at the point where you ask the Indigenous person what they want to do. They may just have a better idea than you. It's possible. Or maybe you come up with something together that's completely different altogether, but this is what we need to do. I want to mention one. I have some fantastic partnerships in this town. Melbourne's such a great town. The Australian Tapestry Workshop, Orchestra Victoria, Plexus Ensemble, Rubik's Collective. You know, there are some fantastic ensembles and people that I work with here who've dedicated themselves. The Concert of Melbourne is another one I would mention, and there are many others who've dedicated themselves to building that relationship, that personal relationship, and going on a journey from perhaps not knowing very much to knowing, and then more vitally a step towards understanding. And I want to talk about one project in particular. My experience in setting Indigenous languages has led to a commission from the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra to compose the music for an acknowledgement to country. This piece of music will be played before each and every concert given by the MSO. For this project, I had the great privilege of working with no fewer than 11 ancient languages from around the state of Victoria, including the language of my late grandmother, Yorta Yorta woman, Frances McGee. I want to pay my deepest respects to all the elders and ancestors who are represented in these songs of acknowledgement, and to the language custodians themselves, the custodians of this essential part of our nation's identity, the language that's embedded in this land still. I'm really proud of the MSO for initiating this landmark project and affording me the opportunity to make this contribution to the ongoing quest for understanding our belonging in this land. I've called the work Long Time Living Here. Yes, it's dedicated to the First Nations people, but it's also an encouragement to all Australians to find a way to enter into that stream of continuous being. Perfect. It was a steep learning curve for MSO, lots and lots of bumps along the way. Sometime between now and the end of the year, Jessica Hitchcock will record all 11 languages, and those recordings will be gifted back to the custodians who were so generous in giving us the language to use for the project, 11 different Indigenous languages from Victoria. That project will be copied by many people, many organisations, and I'm sure MSO will be glad of that. As performers, and there are many of you in the room, in this magnificent room, as performers, each and every time we step in front of an audience, whether they be seated in a magnificent temple to sound like this, or in the local school hall, we are in the business of arts education. We have a duty of care to our young artists, whoever they are, because they're working hard to develop an identity, their identity, in a country which still struggles to rise above its long-running identity crisis. The further we move away from the arts being that central role in society, the deeper that crisis becomes. We know that many Australians are yet to realise the true depth and beauty of our Indigenous cultures. And it's holding us back. Many Australians do not know that they are a long way from taking the journey from not knowing to knowing, and from knowing to understanding. This is where the arts, and in particular music, has a critical role to play in conveying the truth of our shared belonging on this land. A song is not just a song. In this quest, undiluted cultural authority is paramount. I say this as someone who's taken that journey. I'm stolen generation. I didn't have the privilege of growing up in my Aboriginal community. It was my song that led me home, though. And just like Australia, when I started out, I didn't really know who I was at all. There was so much of my identity yet to be uncovered, to be known and eventually understood. Music has afforded me the opportunity to develop the understanding of who I am and how I fit into this world. Just as I have made my own journey from not knowing to knowing and from knowing to understanding, I would ask the same of our nation. And I would see that journey shaped and nurtured by an emotionally mature, respectful arts community who have the courage and determination to remain faithful in the service of music, dance, art, and narrative. This year, as the Peggy Glanville-Hicks Address celebrates its coming of age, the 21st address, I challenge you to embrace your arts practice in the same way Indigenous Australians have longer here than anywhere else on the planet, as an essential way of knowing the world and giving meaning to everything in it. Thank you.
If I may, on behalf of all of us, Deborah, thank you so much. That was an astonishingly inspiring and moving and, in the best possible way, formidable speech. And I hope that all of us might have the humility and the courage to take up that beautiful challenge of going from not knowing to understanding. Maybe we can promise one another tonight that we'll do our best to honour that very important call to action. So Deborah Cheetham, we are very privileged to be in your presence, and if this is not cultural leadership embodied, I don't know what is. Thank you so much. Deborah has very kindly said that she's happy to take some questions. So if anyone had a thought, a word, a question, you're very welcome. If you don't, that's also fine. We can adjourn. We've got a microphone, so if you don't mind just waiting one moment, we'll catch your every word.
Deborah, when you're talking about opera and the opera that we love and needing to respect both the composer and the librettist, could we not just change the libretto?
No, I don't think it's always necessary. I think if we want to change the libretto, or if we want to put Tosca in a pair of jeans and a white T-shirt, then just do something new. We need to champion new works. We can't, in the 21st century, hand on the legacy of 19th century and 18th century opera. That's ridiculous. We have to champion our opera, our music, now. That's what we're tasked to do. That's our role. No, I don't really believe in changing the libretto. Where do you draw the line on that? You know, the librettos that come from Shakespeare or the librettos that come from, you know, some of the French masters of the 18th century? No, I think I really charge the artistic directors of companies to pay more attention, the producers to be more diligent, and the directors to be more respectful. I don't think anyone needed to see Tosca gunned down with a machine gun. That took away that character's last agency in that opera when she leaps from the parapet of the Castle Sant'Angelo. That was gratuitous violence. So no, don't change it, because you can't trust it to be changed to something better. Just do something new. I think equally, don't shoot Carmen, she's stabbed. Just don't do it. It's a totally different thing. And the point is, you know, people say, oh, why must we see this? Because a woman dies at the hand of her partner every week in Australia. Lots of them are stabbed. It's real. But what we have to do is we have to treat that in a way that makes it unacceptable. Completely unacceptable, not gratifying in any way. And that's tricky. And that's where you need directors who dedicate their entire lives to the art form. Because you're grappling with every art form, actually. And I don't think it always works to bring people in from other genres. Sometimes it has, but I haven't seen too many that I think have really entirely worked. Because people come in and they want to change something. If you want to change something, commission something new. I am not taking any more commissions until the end of 2021, so that wasn't a plug for me. I have enough.
But she has friends.
I do. I have friends. Another question? Well, then I'll talk to that subject a bit more. At the very least, operas that you go to that have explicit violence in them should come with some process around that. You know, in the program note, in the myriad of resources that we have online now, it needs to come with, the kind of additional assistance that you get when you hear a disturbing news item and helplines are listed at the end of it because we know that's going to affect people. I think that's important. I mean, The Merry Widow may have been my first opera, but at the end of that week I went to see Yunufa. It's about the bleakest opera that you can imagine by Janacek and by anybody. And, you know, as a 14-year-old, I didn't process that then. I was only processing the music and it was going in. But I loved it as an experience as much as anything else. But I know more now. I mean, look, here's the thing. We're in the grip of such fear in Australia, and it's been taught and it's deliberate. We're being taught to fear losing our funding. We're being taught to fear that we'll somehow lose some part of our national identity if Indigenous people are given the equal role that they deserve. We're just being taught to fear all the time, and it's such a debilitating emotion. I encourage anyone that I work with, the students in the choir that we have together, Jess and Tony and I and Tam, I say to them constantly, it's okay not to know. Don't be afraid or feel ashamed that you don't know something. It's just not okay to not bother to find out. That's where the problem is. But we fear not knowing. You know, I see people who fear saying the Aboriginal word because they'll mispronounce it. You know, just look, you probably got macchiato wrong the first time you said it too, right? Just practice it, for goodness sake. and get over that fear. And yes, and you may have been, I've made the mistakes. And I grew up in an all-white family in a stolen generation situation. You don't think that I've made mistakes myself, that I didn't know things about my community, but I was expected to know because of the way I look. So be courageous and say, yes, I didn't know. And there was that time that I thought it was great to set an Indigenous text and I didn't ask anybody about it. But next time I won't do that. Next time I'll find a better way of doing that. And that's what I'm looking to. A future that's better than the past, and one that sort of just disarms this constant fear we seem to be in. Yes. I might be able to hear you. Just give it a go. I can. It's a miracle. We're in the salon. You can hear everything.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you for your beautiful speech.
No worries.
I was very peripherally involved with the beautiful work you've recently done with the MSO, and I learnt quite a lot through the process. And I was wondering,
which one was that?
The Acknowledgement of Country.
The Acknowledgement of Country.
And it's a really special process because there's so many languages involved, and some of them are quite new and are being, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but they're being rediscovered or they're being reclaimed.
Revitalised. Revived,
Yeah.
all of those words.
And I understand that it was important to have, to be very delicate around that situation of getting those translations and those languages and then the MSO using them and sharing them publicly. And I think it's really special to do that, but there's a whole lot of nuance that I certainly didn't understand. And I think it would be really interesting if you spoke a little to that process of sharing languages, especially new ones.
Well, as artists, we're in the business of nuance. If we're not, we should do something else, you know. And so it's very important, and it's great that you've identified that. There's a divide in Australia, and it's this. You are either the beneficiary of the dispossession of early colonisation, or you are the people who paid for it. And how we bring those two halves of society together, this music is necessary. But we have to remember it is a delicate operation because everything was taken. Everything. Lives, identity, language, land, everything was taken. And it's only just the generation, I think the generation of parents of our children in Dungala Children's Choir, for instance, so that's the youngest member is 8, I want to say, up to about 16 years old. So it's only that generation of parents who now feel safe to pass language on to their children because their parents didn't learn language because their grandparents were punished for speaking language by having their children taken from them for speaking in their language. And no one could be trusted. The church dobbed them in. The mission managers were on the lookout for it always. So it is a really delicate operation. It's like you're holding a delicate fabric that could disintegrate in your hands any moment now, and you have to treat it very delicately so that it can be restored. And I think that for the main part that has happened. Of course there will be mistakes. Gosh, it's so odd to think of a nation that's so fearful of its mistakes it can't address them. As a musician, you probably learn the most about your instrument and what you do through mistakes. I don't know, that's just how I feel about it. Maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. But, I do think that it is delicate work, and some people just go in boots and all and, ring me 5 minutes to the closing time for the application to get my endorsement. And, I've learnt to say no to that. And if you don't have a relationship with me where you've stood in the room with me, you're unlikely to get my yes. But I've come across recently projects that are going on right now, that are funded right now, that are bandying my name around, and I'm not involved at all. So That's partly what drives this conversation. But that's just me. There are hundreds of Indigenous artists that are suffering the same fate. So it is a delicate time. But be gentle with it the way you would with anything else that you valued and cherished. Just do that. Don't resent it because you have to be careful. That's just mean. And I'm not saying, of course, I'm not saying this of MSO, but there is a lot of resentment out there in the community. I didn't do it, why should I care? Well, because you are the beneficiary or the person who paid for it. And that, until we become a nuanced and mature society through the placing of arts in its central role, at the centre of society, not as some handmaiden to sport, not as some, extra add-on that you think about after you've spent your money on everything else. No, not even about money, just something that's integral to who we are as human beings. Now, we're not meant to know. We're not meant to know. That is why the arts are in such a parlous state. That is why things are so difficult. What could possibly disturb governments more than an emotionally mature electorate? How do we arrive at that emotional maturity? Through arts education, through participation in the arts, all arts. I still listen to ABBA, I'm not just saying classical music, but that's my language, classical music, because I had a particular education afforded to me. If I'd grown up in community, I would have had a very different education. I probably would have ended up being a country and western singer, as was the way of all of my family. I have a very famous uncle in Jimmy Little. He was my mother's eldest brother. And so there's music there, right? But there's music here. It's also in your DNA. I don't corner the market on that as an Aboriginal person. It's just that the disconnection of it being central to your very being happened some time ago, and for Aboriginal people it's continued on up until very recently. It's in all of us. It's the way humanity knows. See, I said my answers are as long as the actual speech. I did warn you of that. I said that before. I did. I told them.
And we're loving it. No one's complaining.
Oh, good. Sure, I can't see whether they're complaining.
They'll speak to us later if they are, yeah. Are there any other questions? Well, perhaps we could thank Deborah one more time for her brilliance and her inspiration. Thank you for joining us. Please join us now if you have time for drinks and further conversation. And thanks also to our, as usual, beautiful hosts at MRC. Thanks everyone. Good night.